She had an aura of attracting you to her. She would draw you to dance with her.
It feels good. It's good to be back here and have our family and friends supporting us here in our hometown.
There are voices that time cannot silence. Voices that continue to echo through decades, through grief, through the kind of loss that reshapes everything it touches. Selena Quintanilla had one of those voices. Rich, warm, electric, the kind that made you feel seen even if you had never met her, even if you did not speak her language, even if you had grown up worlds apart from the dusty Texas towns where her story began. She was 23 years old when the world lost her, and 30 years later, the wound has never fully closed. Not for her fans. Not for her family. And certainly not for the man who loved her most, her husband, Chris Pérez. For 3 decades, Chris Pérez has carried something heavy. He has carried it through solo albums and memorial concerts, through a remarriage and a divorce, through a memoir and a Netflix series, through thousands of interviews where journalists asked him the same questions and he answered them with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed his grief so many times it has become a kind of armor. But armor, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually shows its cracks. And recently, Chris Pérez has begun to speak in a way that feels different. Deeper. More unguarded. The world is listening, and what he is saying is leaving people genuinely shaken. To understand why Chris Pérez's words carry so much weight, you have to understand who Selena was. Not just the icon, not just the Billboard charts and the bedazzled busties and the Jennifer Lopez biopic, but the actual human being who walked into Chris's life and rearranged it permanently. Selena Quintanilla was born on April 16, 1971, in Lake Jackson, Texas, the youngest child of Abraham Quintanilla Jr. and Marcela Zamora. Her father, a former musician himself, recognized something extraordinary in his daughter almost from infancy. By the time Selena was 9 years old, Abraham had formed a family band, Selena y los Dinos, built largely around his youngest child's voice. The family struggled financially in those early years, performing at quinceañeras, weddings, and small venues across South Texas, sometimes driving hours for a gig that paid barely enough to cover gas. Selena performed in a pizza restaurant her family briefly owned. She sang to nearly empty rooms. She kept singing anyway. What Abraham understood, and what the world would eventually come to understand, was that Selena's talent was not the ordinary kind that can be cultivated through discipline alone. She had something innate, an emotional intelligence that translated directly into sound. She could take a lyric about heartbreak or longing or joy and make you feel it physically, in your chest, behind your eyes. And she did this in Spanish, a language she was still learning as a teenager because she had grown up speaking primarily English at home. She practiced her pronunciation obsessively. She carried notebooks filled with phonetic translations. The dedication was staggering. By the late 1980s, Selena was winning Tejano Music Awards at an age when most of her peers were still navigating high school hallways. By the early 1990s, she was filling arenas. Her 1992 album Entre Mi Mundo produced the massive hit Como La Flor, a cumbia-inflected heartbreak song that became an anthem for a generation of young Latinas who had never before seen themselves reflected on a mainstream stage. Her 1994 album Amor Prohibido was nominated for a Grammy. She was on the cover of magazines. She was designing clothing. She was, in every measurable sense, becoming one of the most important artists in American music, not just Latin music, but American music, full stop. A crossover album was in production. The English-speaking mainstream was finally about to meet Selena on her own terms, and then March 31, 1995, happened. The circumstances of Selena's death have been documented extensively over the past 30 years. Yolanda Soldivo, who had been the president of Selena's fan club before transitioning into the role of manager for Selena's boutiques, had been discovered to be embezzling funds. Confrontations had been building for weeks. On that final morning, Selena went to Soldivo's room at a Days Inn in Corpus Christi, Texas, hoping to retrieve business documents and reach some kind of resolution. What happened inside that room changed everything. Soldivo shot Selena with a .38 caliber revolver. The bullet struck her shoulder, severing a major artery. Selena ran from the room and made it to the lobby before collapsing. She died at Corpus Christi Medical Center at 1:05 p.m. She was 23 years old. The grief that followed was immediate, massive, and multinational. Fans gathered outside the hospital. Radio stations played her music on loop. The governor of Texas declared April 3 Selena Day. The scale of public mourning surprised many Americans who had not been fully aware of her reach, and it forced a conversation about how thoroughly mainstream American media had overlooked the Latin community that had adored Selena for years. Bill Clinton called her the Hispanic Elvis. The comparison felt both apt and insufficient. Yolanda Soldivo was convicted of first-degree murder in October 1995 and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. That parole eligibility date has recently arrived, and it has reopened wounds across the Quintanilla family and the broader fan community, a development that provides important context for why Chris Pérez has chosen this particular moment to speak more openly than he ever has before. Chris Pérez entered Selena's life professionally before he entered it personally. He joined Selena y Los Dinos as a guitarist in 1989, recruited for his technical skill and his musical instincts. He was 20 years old. She was 18. By most accounts, the attraction was immediate, complicated, and entirely mutual. They worked to keep it quiet, knowing that Abraham Quintanilla, who managed the band with an iron hand and a fierce protectiveness over his daughter, would not approve they were right. When Abraham discovered the relationship in 1992, his reaction was severe enough that he fired Chris from the band. What he had not anticipated was that Selena would follow Chris out the door. She was willing to walk away from the career her father had built for her rather than lose the man she loved. Faced with this ultimatum, Abraham relented. He allowed the relationship to continue on the condition that they marry, which they did, quietly and quickly, on April 2, 1992. They were young and deeply in love and entirely unprepared for what was coming. Though no one is ever truly prepared for something like what came, their marriage lasted 3 years before Selena was taken from him. 3 years. Chris Pérez has now spent a decade longer being Selena's widower than he spent being her husband. Think about that. He has carried the weight of her absence for 10 times longer than he carried the joy of her presence. And yet, by every account he has given publicly, the love has not diminished. If anything, it has become something enormous and architectural, a thing that holds the structure of his life together even as it makes certain rooms in that structure permanently uninhabitable. In recent interviews and public statements, Chris Pérez has begun pulling back layers that he kept tightly wrapped for most of the past 3 decades. Part of what has prompted this, by his own admission, is the passage of time and the particular gravity of a 30-year milestone. Part of it is the renewed public attention surrounding Soldivo's parole hearings. And part of it, perhaps most significantly, is a recognition that the version of his story most people know, the version filtered through biopics and documentaries and carefully managed public appearances, is incomplete in ways that have quietly bothered him for years. One of the things Chris has spoken about with increasing candor is the profound isolation he experienced in the immediate aftermath of Selena's death. The public grief was everywhere and it was enormous, but Chris was grieving in a specific and singular way that no one around him quite understood. He had not just lost a beloved public figure. He had lost his wife. He had lost the person he spoke to every morning. He had lost the person who knew what he was thinking before he said it. He had lost the specific, private, irreplaceable texture of daily life with Selena, the way she laughed, the things she worried about, the conversations they had when no one was watching, and he was grieving this in public, in the middle of a media firestorm, surrounded by a family that was processing its own devastating loss in its own way, with a history between himself and Abraham Quintanilla that added complicated undertones to every interaction. He has described this period as one of the loneliest of his life, which is a remarkable thing to be able to say about a time when the entire world seemed to be grieving alongside you. The relationship between Chris Pérez and the Quintanilla family has been one of the most quietly significant subplots of the past 30 years. On the surface, it has been a relationship of shared grief and shared legacy, marked by cooperative appearances at tributes and memorials. Beneath the surface, it has been more complicated. Abraham Quintanilla has exercised significant control over Selena's image and estate, and this control has occasionally put him at odds with Chris, who has his own intimate knowledge of who Selena was and his own strong feelings about how her story should be told. The Netflix series Selena, the series, which premiered in 2020, became a flashpoint for some of these tensions. Chris was involved in the production to a degree but has spoken openly about feeling that certain aspects of his relationship with Selena, particularly its complexity, its private tenderness, the full arc of what they shared, were flattened or misrepresented in the interest of a cleaner narrative. He has been measured in how he expresses this, careful not to turn his grief into a public dispute, but the frustration has been palpable in interviews where he discusses the series. What Chris seems to want, more than anything, is for people to know the real Selena. Not the icon. Not the merchandise. Not the carefully curated image. The real woman, the one who was funny and stubborn and occasionally insecure and deeply curious and profoundly kind. The one who worried about her fans and worked herself to the point of exhaustion and loved with a completeness that left no room for halfway. He talks about her laugh. He talks about her cooking. He talks about the way she could walk into a room and make everyone in it feel like the most important person there. He talks about her in the present tense sometimes, catches himself, and keeps going anyway. The question of Yolanda Soldivo's potential parole has added a dimension of urgency to Chris's recent public statements that is impossible to separate from everything else he has been saying. The idea that the woman who murdered his wife might be released from prison has been described by Chris, by Selena's family, and by fans around the world as a source of renewed and acute pain. Soldivo has, over the years, given her own interviews and maintained her claim that the shooting was accidental, a position that Chris and the Quintanilla family have consistently and vehemently rejected. Chris has spoken about this carefully but clearly. He believes in the justice system's original verdict. He believes the evidence, the conviction, and the sentence were correct. He believes that Selena's life had an immeasurable value that was cut short by an act that was neither accidental nor ambiguous, regardless of what Soldivo has continued to claim. And he believes that the public ought to understand the full weight of what was lost on March 31, 1995. Not just the cultural icon, not just the music that was never made, but the specific irreplaceable human being who was his wife. That I end speaking these things out loud, more directly than he has before. Chris is doing something that takes genuine courage. Grief is not a comfortable thing to display. It makes people uneasy. After 30 years, there is a social expectation that the bereaved will have reached some plateau of equilibrium, that the sharp edges will have worn smooth, that public statements on the subject will be more celebratory than raw. Chris Pérez, at this particular moment in time, is refusing that expectation. He is choosing rawness. He is choosing honesty. And the world, watching him do it, is finding itself moved in ways it did not entirely anticipate. There is a moment in Chris Pérez's memoir, To Selena, with Love, published in 2012, that has circulated widely on social media in recent months as his public profile has renewed. He describes the last ordinary morning he had with Selena, not March 31st itself, but the day before, a morning of coffee and conversation and the particular unremarkable happiness of two people who are deeply comfortable with each other. He did not know it was the last ordinary morning. Of course he did not know. That is the nature of last ordinary mornings. They do not announce themselves. He has spoken in recent interviews about how that memory, so small, so domestic, so entirely devoid of any cinematic quality, is the one he returns to most often. Not the concerts. Not the awards. Not the glamour of the life they were building together. A morning. Coffee. Her voice. The way the light came in. This is what Yolanda Soldivo took. Not just the icon. Not just the music. A morning. A voice. A light. Selena Quintanilla would have been 54 years old this year. It is genuinely difficult to imagine what she might have become. The crossover career that was just beginning at the time of her death would almost certainly have made her one of the defining pop figures of the late 1990s and beyond. The fashion empire she was building was ahead of its time in ways that seem obvious in retrospect. She was interested in acting. She was interested in philanthropy. She was interested in everything. She had the kind of restless, generous intelligence that tends to find its way into every available space.